with,
maybe everybody.
we're going to start with the personal income tax changes. So we're going to hand around a document here. Now this is, so this large document, on the department's website, every year we publish the legislative highlights that relate to tax changes. And we try to, have a little title, a bullet, a reference to the act, where those changes were passed. Try to explain them a little bit, but in that document, it's more of a roadmap. We don't necessarily go into a lot of detail. So this is the printed version of it. And you can find those documents going back to, I believe, 2009 or so, maybe even earlier. Now, we're working on making them a little bit more searchable, but for the moment, you kind of have to pull open each year and look at the year to find what you might be wanting. So, I'm not going to go through this entire document, but I just want people to be aware that this is something we keep on our website. And we update, generally this is going to go up in late May, well, no, not late May, no, late June. We never turned around to say that. And for today, I want to start out with talking about personal income tax, property tax adjustments, because honestly, that's what affects most people in Vermont. So on page 5, about halfway down the page on page 5, is where the personal income tax section starts. So the first change, and this is to this is for 529 plans. So for that's a federal definition of a 529 plan, an education savings kind of account. And the change here is not the treatment of those plans. That's federally regulated, but there's a Vermont tax credit that's related to making contributions to a 529 plan. And in 2017, federal law was changed so that those 529 plans could now be used to pay for primary and secondary education, as opposed to just post-secondary. So the Vermont legislature chose to decouple, and this was also a proposal from BSAC, and the tax department supported it, to decouple from the federal definition. And if money's drawn out of a 529 plan that was used for primary or secondary, so not post-secondary or any other unauthorized use, we're going to recapture the tax credit that the Vermont taxpayer realized. So that is starting in tax year 2019. Tax year 2018, that's gone. It was not made retroactive to that extent. So going forward, any withdrawals that are not used for college, for post-secondary, could be subject to this recapture. Annual link to the federal statutes. Now, there are many ways that Vermont is now decoupled. In 2018, we decoupled from a lot of amounts, from the standard deduction amount, from the personal exemption amount, which is federally at 0 now. But we do link to the federal statutes for definitions. So when you're talking about concepts like the standard deduction, the personal exemption, we're still linking to the federal government there. Capital gains exclusion. And please stop me if you have a question on any particular item. Capital gains exclusion. This starts at the bottom of page 5, but then goes across. Capital gains in Vermont are treated in 2 separate ways. One is a $5,000 exclusion, and it's an either/or. That is a broader types of capital gains that you can use that for, and that was unimpacted. So the $5,000 flat exclusion has not been changed. If you have capital gains from specific types of investments, generally speaking, it's investment property, farm property, or standing timber. Those types of capital gains can qualify for this 40% exclusion. Prior to this law being passed, that exclusion was just 40% off of whatever number it was. And now it's 40% off of up to $875,000. So the exclusion amount is capped at $350,000 of excluded income. That is honestly going to impact only about 80 or so tax filers in Vermont every year. It is quite rare for Vermonters to get more than $900,000 of capital gains in a year.
And most people use the $5,000 exclusion.
Yes, yeah, the $5,000 exclusion is much higher volume. And that can be used for publicly traded stocks, many more things. The 40% is specific to, it's intended to be used for when you're selling a business, when you're selling a long-held property that you've put effort and time into. I believe that's the policy intention behind, actually the federal capital gains rates initially. And that 40% actually mimics the federal rate structure. Federally, you have a lower capital gains rate, and it's around 60% of the normal rate. Health insurance mandate. So this is an interesting one. So for health insurance, in 2018, it was passed that all Vermonters are required to have health insurance. However, there's no financial penalty for not having health insurance, and there's no requirement to report if you didn't have health insurance. So it was passed, it was more of an aspirational law saying all Vermonters should have health insurance. There's still no financial penalty, but starting in tax year 2020, so taxes that are filed in 2021, there will be some information where taxpayers have to put down whether or not they and their dependents have health care coverage. So that's not going to affect us until for a year and a half or so. And then the reason for this is to record that information and share it with the Department of Vermont Health Access so they can monitor the uninsured population in Vermont and try to take steps, use that for outreach, try to get people to retain health insurance. Generally speaking, the more of your population is insured, the lower your rates are going to be. So if we have too many people drop insurance, then some people are rightfully concerned about that. The next is the medical deduction. In 2018, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of December 2017, Vermont decoupled. The governor and the legislature worked pretty closely on that and basically moved away from itemized deductions. Itemized deductions are no longer recognized in Vermont. This last session, there was some testimony, came back several thousand individuals in Vermont had medical deductions that were significant in their situation, I think a highly sympathetic situation. The governor and the legislature agreed that, to recreate a limited form of the medical deduction for that population. It's really focused on the reason for reinstituting it was, primarily for people with catastrophic events, but the math is going to work out so that people who are deducting now are going to receive about the same financial benefit that they would have received before. So you start out with your federally allowable medical deductions, and then you subtract your standard deduction, your personal exemptions. And then it's capped at, if it's a long-term, a continuing care retirement facility, this last section about the continuing care retirement facility, that's only going to impact an extremely small number of taxpayers in Vermont, generally between, I think it's like 1 to 200 at the most, that would have to consider that last element. So for most of those 3,000, it's that top section of that.
So, changes at the federal level, most of my clients who are able to still itemize based on medical expenses, it's because of not retirement communities, but they're not called retirement communities. They can't be the word right now. Sorry, this is a lot of people from maybe talking to. But like they're at the veterans home or the
assisted living centers.
Assisted living, yeah. Right? Or the the higher levels beyond assisted living. So you're saying those can't be counted? Is that what this is?
Most forms of assisted living are not going to be impacted by that last bullet.
Okay, so this is retirement communities? I'm just not clear.
Right.
Yeah. Wake Rob.
Okay.
He's the only CCRC we have in the state of Vermont.
Okay. All
Right.
That tells me what.
And then so it has to do with that, and then certain qualified premiums paid on long-term care insurance contracts.
Right. A community, a
That part.
continuing care retirement community is a definition under the Department of Financial Regulation, and we could get more of those in the future.
Right.
But for right now, there's only one, and then there's one just over the border in Hanover.
Kendall. We're different
Yeah.
tax structure over there.
Yes.
Very different.
So yeah, the major difference there is, subtracting out the standard deduction and the personal exemptions. And then, honestly, that last change about solar energy investment credit, that's cleanup, that's not a substantive change. That's just making sure that we recapture the credit the same way we always have been. It's a technical change, and it didn't change anything in the functioning of the solar credit or how we recapture it. Moving on to the property owner section. Again, education property tax, which I'm sure everyone is excited to continue talking about. As I mentioned during the presentation, non-residential was changed to non-homestead. And that was a suggestion that was obviously brought up by the legislature. They're the only ones that can propose legislation. But the tax department definitely supported that change. The joint fiscal office supported that change. It's a more accurate term from a tax nerd perspective. Residential property, if you've ever worked with a realtor or anyone who assesses property, residential is a very significant term when you're talking about property. So we definitely supported the change from non-residential to non-homestead. But it didn't change anything in the tax treatment. Nobody was shifted or treated differently because of that label change. Current use definitions. These two are actually, Robin mentioned the taxpayer advocate before, and these changes actually, one of them came from the taxpayer advocate, I believe. Basically, the first bullet is, it's basically not requiring an application where we have in the past, so it's trying to make it easier on people who are going through a divorce situation. So people that are divorcing will no longer need to file current use applications for the program. They'll just need to let us know that there's a new owner on the parcel. And then the next one is obviously amazingly technical, and we changed exceeds 999 years to a minimum of 999 years. Believe it or not, that is important. Current use tax liens. To try to move through this one pretty quickly. If you enter the current use program, you're going to agree to place a tax lien on your property, and this change made that a contingent lien, making it won't cloud your title. If you're going to mortgage that property or someone else is going to buy that property, a mortgage can be placed with priority on that property without current use interfering. So this was primarily done to make it so that people that had land in current use wouldn't have so much trouble financing property, refinancing or selling their property to a different owner. If the new owner develops that land, it changed nothing with the penalties involved in, developing current use land. But that was designed to make buying and selling current use land less of a headache. Definition of homestead. This is a taxpayer advocate proposal, and it allows. Basically, there are situations where the widow or widower of a property is expected to inherit the property. They're still living there. They're going through the estate process, but they haven't formally become the full owner. And we had to hold property tax credits up because of that. So this allows, if there's a reasonable chance of inheriting, for us to go ahead and process that credit without it going to the taxpayer advocate. There was relief there before, but only for the people that knew to contact the advocate. Household income, another taxpayer advocate issue. Now, and again, this is actually what I was kind of self-deprecatingly referring to. I have participated in making the system more complex. This allows people to exclude income if they're separated or divorced. This is an abused or separated spouse, a restraining order. So that income does not have to be included in the household. And also, we will pull out cancellation of debt income when we're considering the household income. So It might be up to 26 or 27 elements now for household income, which, again, these situations kind of lend themselves to, we want to fix this situation, it doesn't seem right, but again, the complexity just piles up over the years as we try to fix all these individual scenarios. Income sensitivity adjustment was renamed property tax credit. That is actually significant because in the consideration for SNAP benefits and other things, credits are treated differently than adjustments. The current federal government is unlikely to revert their position based on us changing the language, but it didn't hurt anyone to change the language, so it's possible that the federal government might treat people more favorably for SNAP benefits because it's a tax credit. So that's why that change was made. The yields that were set, and again, that I talked about in the presentation, of $10,648 in setting the homestead rate, $13,081 for income yield, and that's going to get you, if you have that much, you'll get 2% household income percentage. And then the non-resident, non-homestead rate, see, we even messed up our own document right there, of 159. And I've reviewed this document many times, but did not get it all right. Land gains, actually we modernized the land gains without going too far down a very deep rabbit hole. Land gains was created in the 70s for very good reasons, to prevent real estate speculation, to prevent fragmentation of Vermont parcels. A lot of good reasons. We proposed repealing it because of Act 250 and zoning. We compromised with a lot of advocates that didn't feel like it was safe to remove it. And now, land gains only applies if you break up a parcel, if you subdivide. If you take a 10-acre parcel and you break it into 2 5-acre parcels within 6 years, you could owe land gains tax. There are still exemptions, but it narrowed the funnel. And that actually eliminated 87% of transactions where people were selling the property exactly as they found it from an acreage perspective. So this was a modernization. It allows us to not tax and not look at the transactions that aren't really the problem. Fragmentation is still, I think, a problem for many advocates, for many environmentalists in Vermont. And then the last one in the property section is property transfer tax. Controlling interest. This is property transfer tax that always goes on the buyer and a transfer by deed. This creates a corresponding structure for a business-to-business transaction. So it's an either or. It's either you get taxed because of the business-to-business or because of the deed. It doesn't change anything for 95 or more % of the people that are just buying houses, buying and taking over the deed. But it adds a business-to-business structure that the department is still working on regulations and rules and new forms to accommodate those transactions.
This event's doing booking agents and market news.
All right. So the next one I would talk about is on page 2. Yep. Bottom, or not quite the bottom of page 2. But the second title there, taxation of electronic cigarettes. Essentially, the definition of other tobacco products, which has a 92% tax rate at the wholesale deal, like the distribution level, at wholesaler level, that was expanded to account to include vaping products, so fluid, vaping devices themselves. And so that was effective July 1st. So we've collected about 3 months of revenue now under that new structure. And it's actually about 4 times higher than anticipated. So we've already...
It's been fine.
I can't remember what we anticipated.
So I worked with Joint Fiscal Office on an estimate, and it was
Right.
$850,000.
Yeah.
But we didn't have data to estimate it very well.
Right.
So we never claimed it was,
Yeah.
But we've already hit just over $900,000 in the first 3 months of events.
It's better than the other direction.
Right.
The whole idea is that it's a public health issue.
Right. There was honestly nothing in the national or international data that would have led me to think that the receipts would be as high as they are. So the anecdotes that we heard about vaping really skyrocketing and increasing a great amount over 2017 and 2018, I think the data shows that those anecdotes were correct. That the usage had dramatically increased in 2019, and we have no data to really look at that.
Well, the other thing we did, and it's not on here because it's on the tax thing, is that we raised the smoking age for all cars to 21.
Right.
And that started October 1st.
September 1st.
September. I thought we delayed it by 1 month.
It
Maybe it was that. Okay,
Yeah,
well, whatever
it
it
ended up
was,
being
we don't
September
know
1st.
whether that's going to impact, whether we've had this big peak, we've been stocked up, and whether it's going to change or not.
September's receipts were not enough lower than August for me to say anything about them. They were relatively consistent. So once we get to next September, next July, next August, we might be able to compare the two, but
Right.
that's also hard because it was the launch of the tax.
Right.
So, but at this point, we have not seen the e-cigarette receipts starting to just go dramatically down. So we want to, all right, so one area where the department actually helped recommend this was to change the definition of operator for the rooms tax. So the rooms tax is a 9% tax on the rental of short-term rental of rooms. And many properties in Vermont now, thousands of properties are listed through Airbnb or VRBO or HomeAway. But the legal responsibility to collect that rooms tax still lied with the homeowner, the person that owned that property and rented out, not with Airbnb or HomeAway. What this law did is it just changed the legal responsibility to be the internet platform. Because they're the ones facilitating the transaction. They have all the data they need, and there wasn't a huge amount of pushback from that community to oppose collecting it. The other thing this accomplished was there was a service charge that was being applied in addition to the rent, and this clarifies that anything that's collected by that booking agent is rent. So the 18-20% booking charges that they were excluding from the tax basis are no longer excluded from the tax basis.
So this is like Expedia, Booking.com, not just Airbnb,
Right.
all of those places.
Yeah. And the important thing here,
Says they're handling all the money.
Yes.
That's right.
The person themselves is in possession of money, so.
yeah. And again, this didn't raise any tax rates, this didn't impose a new tax, but we estimate it'll generate about $4 million, 3.9 I think was the official estimate. And it's been, the revenue sources have been behaving. This one's hard to separate from the overall rooms tax
Yeah.
receipts, but the rooms tax has been behaving well, it has been hitting target. And so going to page 8. It's marketplace. So this is actually a very similar concept, but actually chicken and the egg style, this one is actually before the booking agents one. A couple of years ago, the Wayfair case was decided. Wayfair was basically North Dakota?
South Dakota.
I get that right like 50% of the time. South Dakota versus Wayfair, and South Dakota was trying to say, no, it doesn't matter that you don't have a physical presence in our state, you have to collect our sales tax. So they went to the Supreme Court, eventually the Supreme Court took up that case, and then won. The legislature had a law in from a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, saying if the Wayfair case is decided in South Dakota's favor, then Vermont will begin collecting sales tax from remote sellers on the next quarter. It ended up being about a week and a half that they had to switch
22nd was
over.
the case, and it started July 1st.
So it wasn't a lot of time for people, but we had that law on the books, so they knew it was there if they were following the Wayfair case. When I say they, I mean larger online retailers.
And so you may remember Amazon was threatening, when states were saying you have to collect taxes, they were threatening to dump all their affiliates, and they were just being kind of nasty because they didn't want to do this well. Now they're doing it.
Right. So marketplace, this language built upon that. So in 2018, we started collecting from remote sellers. July 1st, 2019, because of this law change, marketplaces are now responsible for collecting and remitting all of that sales tax for any transactions that go through their site. So that again didn't raise a tax rate, didn't increase what was taxable, but is estimated to bring in about 13.4 million of additional money for the education fund. So in setting the tax rates, that actually reduced the tax rates by almost 2 cents.
That should tell you a little about how often use tax was reported.
So, I know you were trying to avoid getting into the business and corporate tax section, but.
We'll go wherever you want.
Yeah.
Cool. The sale of tangible goods and services are now apportioned to Vermont if taxpayers market for the sale is in Vermont. Market for the sale.
Yes.
It's not if the sale occurs in Vermont. Can you just say what that means in regular? I read it like 6 times and I don't quite understand.
Yeah, that's true. That is confusing language.
I mean, I know what intangible goods and services are.
Right.
So this is called market-based sourcing for corporate apportionment. So prior to this, Vermont was cost of performance. So let's say you are an architect working out of New York and you're selling your plans to somebody in Vermont. Before this change, that activity would not have been taxable to Vermont because Vermont would have said the source of the cost of performance was New York. But market-based now means that because the source of where the services were being delivered was Vermont, it's now considered Vermont.
So it's where did the thing get sold? Where?
Yes,
Is what we're
yes.
saying.
And isn't this, like, it's the Comcast, it's the telecommunications company?
Telecommunications is one major industry on this. I mean, frankly, the reason that this is also useful for Vermont is because the vast majority of other states are in market-based sourcing now. And so what ends up happening, it's a real disadvantage for Vermont to be cost of performance because some companies are getting hit twice, right? Corporate apportionment is weird because every state has their own rules. And so particularly Vermont companies selling their services into other states were getting hit twice because Vermont was hitting them as cost of performance, then New York is hitting them as market-based. So now everybody in the Northeast, I think, is under market-based.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a much better playing field, I think.
Yeah. And I think to their credit, this idea actually originated, well, I mean, it's been talked about for a while, but Ways and Means really took up the football and ran with it
We
this year.
discovered it, or we were kind of waiting for a bill to come or something. So,
Just
well,
roll on a
actually,
break.
we talked to somebody from the tax foundation too, and they were like, you guys are kind of old fashioned in a few ways, and this was one of them. And we didn't want to be old fashioned.
Once in Vermont. Can't change.
And it supports our Vermont businesses, so
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah.
Well, it makes
So,
my job.
that's the general,
Yeah.
Because if everybody's the same.
Right.
that's the general highlights. Again, you can find this document on the website and follow through the language. We're also have been producing over the summer guidance and fact sheets and updates on particular elements that we felt like market-based sourcing. I think we're working on regulations to describe that and describe actually how we're going to get into the weeds and the nitty-gritty. The next document I have for everyone is on pre-written software access to remote. So this is actually a question that came up in the Ways and Means Committee. Yeah.
When do we go to on this, Deb?
I'm
Is this
sorry?
till 4:30 or 4:15?
Till 4:30.
Okay. We need to finish this. So this is a particular exemption in the sales tax. And when this came up for committee discussion about, what would the impacts of repealing this exemption be, there was quite a bit of confusion and contradictory testimony and difficulty in understanding exactly what we're talking about here. Like kind of that old cartoon about a bunch of blind people touching the elephant. People were touching different parts of the elephant and describing it differently. So what Ways and Means did was they didn't ask, they put it in law that the department would go out and do some outreach and talk to people about this particular exemption. So this fact sheet, front and back, is one thing we put together at the department to help facilitate the discussion. And it's intended.
Is this what it is now or what it would be with the new legislation? On the
So-
back of the check marks?
The back part with the check
Yeah.
boxes, This is what it is now.
What it is now, okay, thank you.
And if you look at the checkboxes in that grid, and then I'll go back to the front page, if the exemption were repealed, the fourth line, that checkbox would move from non-taxable to taxable.
Okay.
So with the rest of this grid, and digital photographs, and digital audio-visual works, and all of these different services and tangible objects, of all these other things, only that one row would change. So the difficulty lies in, okay, well, what is that row? What does that mean? JFO's early estimates were moving that checkbox would generate about 6 million in sales tax, about 3 million from individuals and about 3 million from businesses. Keeping in mind, sales tax is always paid by the customer, but in 50% of those cases, roughly, the customer is a business, it's a business-to-business product. 50% it's more something like TurboTax, or something you're using at home, but you're accessing remotely. So the front page is where at the department, we think that there's three kind of main terminologies here that overlap and that get confused for each other. In the upper right, we have this gray area that talks about software as a service. We think of pre-written software accessed solely through an internet or cloud platform as software as a service. And it's not tangible personal property, it's not downloaded, it's only accessed on a remote platform. And the key element here is, this is likely to be something that used to be delivered. It used to be run locally. It used to be run with a CD or a DVD, but it's now, you're just accessing it through a website. But it's the same thing for everyone. When everyone who's using that is accessing it, it's generally going to be the same product and the same set of functions. It's not custom coded for each, or not modified very much for each customer. Down in the bottom left, we have infrastructure as a service. That's where generally a business is a consumer of infrastructure as a service. Not many individuals have a lot of need for purchasing infrastructure for themselves. But they hire or they pay an IT contractor to operate that infrastructure on their behalf. Basically, if you don't want to run your own servers, you don't want to run your own firewalls or software and security. So that is not taxable and would not become taxable for this exemption to be repealed. And then platform as a service on the bottom right. This is honestly the most difficult to differentiate between software as a service and platform as a service. Because the way we're trying to define it now, and we're open to trying to define and understand this better, but basically a platform as a service is something like Google Ads. It's where you're accessing a website, but the access to that website, it's not the functions that the software is producing, it's the advertising services. It's the other functions that website is giving you and the tools it's giving you that produce the value, not just the pre-written or canned software itself.
So, not anyone who uses Google Ads, I'm going to try something. So like I have an Apple computer and I subscribe to Microsoft because I like Word and Excel, better than the Apple thing. So is that one of these things? Is that platform as a service because I'm using Word and Excel and PowerPoint instead of, did I pay a monthly fee or something to use that? It is downloaded onto my computer.
If it's downloaded, if you get the downloaded version, you were charged sales tax on that. So
right, and then I have to pay every year to keep having it. So I would be paying the sales, and that's already happening now.
yes.
What you're saying.
But sorry, go ahead.
That would be a software as a service.
That is software as a service.
Yeah, but Microsoft Suite would be a software
Yeah.
as a service.
Okay.
So to add on what Secretary Quinn said, there's a version of Office 365 that you don't download, that's software as a service, and that currently is not being charged sales tax on. Unless you install the local versions of the applications, we're not expecting sales tax on Office 365. If you just have the online version,
Oh,
that
I
would
think I
not
have
be
the
subject.
365, so that's not Offices, that's not service.
Well, that's the additional confusion here, is that there's a downloaded version, a full version of
Oh,
Office
okay.
365, and there's a partial or cloud version.
Okay, so you kind of have to know what you have, and I don't know if I know what I have.
So you can buy the subscription and log in just through the website to get to your applications.
Oh,
like
I know, I
Excel,
think it's just on my computer, so I must have downloaded.
Or you could have the downloaded version.
And so I think that's where there's going to be confusion about what counts.
Right. And the reason we consider Office 365 software as a service is that there are somewhere around 10 programs we get in Office 365. I've never actually counted them.
Yeah, oh, 10.
Yeah, around 10 different programs, but they're very canned. You know, they're mass produced and they're canned software packages. A platform as a service is more like a web design tool where you're being provided different tools that are customized to your needs and they're adjusted over time. It's more of, they're helping you design something, they're helping you
So
build
like the
your
website event building or
Yeah.
things like that.
The most common platform as a service is web design tools or coding tools.
Okay, that's.
Right, if this was a coding tool that let you code your own Office 365, that would be platform as a service.
Yes. We anticipate that were this exemption to be repealed, the tax department would likely get a large number of formal ruling requests for different software packages. Right now, we don't have a list of, well, this software package would be taxable, this one wouldn't, because we have to go through the facts involved in every one of them. Right now, it doesn't matter because of this exemption. If it's downloaded, it's taxed. If it's on a CD, it's taxed. If it's accessed remotely, it could be a service. It could be subject to this exemption. We don't care right now. So we don't publish guidance on it.
Right.
And we haven't fully gone through and tried to separate what's platform as a service and what's software as a service. And what is just a service. And I think that's a lot of cause for anxiety and confusion.
Well, there's a few people who are very exercised about this. I assume you're talking to some of those folks or the organizations that maybe thought that a whole lot more was going to get taxed than actually is.
Yeah,
Like the Vermont
Haven't been to
Tech.
Shannon County yet. right?
no,
Yeah, you haven't been to Chittenden County?
We haven't gone to
I can tell you it's going to be there. You probably know too.
We'll push those kids off. Maybe we'll skip them this year.
We'll be asking you in January if you talk to them.
We have actually talked to folks in Chittenden County.
Just the Chamber of
For the
Commerce.
presentation at the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
Thank you guys for your time.
Vermont
thank
Tech.
you.
It was good. Pardon?
So I think we're good on this unless you have anything to add, Secretary?
No, I think this is great. I think this adds quite a bit of detail that I think, people were confused about during the legislative season. And, I think once we go through Chittenden County, it should make it clear to everyone. Everyone may not like it, but it will be clear on
What we're talking
what
about.
we're talking about.
And that's our only goal here, is to try to at least make sure we're all talking about the same thing. All right, so that concludes the tax portion of of this section. So Commissioner Greshin, let's talk about budgeting.
Yeah, talk about all that confusing stuff in taxes. Budgeting is crystal clear.
Yeah, be in and out of here in 3 minutes at this
Yeah.
point, yeah.
Okay, so we got it all on one page.
Here's a little bit of trivia. The Morgan Horse Farm, where we now sit, does in fact get an appropriation from the state. Anyone have any idea what they get? $1. Which is interesting. You'd think in a budget of $6 billion, they get more than $1. But it's a quirk about budgeting. Years ago, this organization received a large appropriation from the state of Vermont. Then it became part of the University of Vermont. And they've, as part of their budget, maintained the horse farm. Yet, the thought was if we completely eliminated it from the state budget, if something should happen in VM, or if they should want to get rid of it, or whatever, and they, once again, needed an appropriation from the state, they at least would already be in the budget. So you know, kind of the old saw about it's easier once you're in the show to remain in the show, as opposed to being completely out of the show and getting back in. So every year, they get a $1 appropriation, which is kind of interesting. I assume we literally give them $1. They must, if it's in the budget, they must get it. I don't know who receives it, but however, most people who get appropriations get more than that. So anyway, you know, I thought I would just say a couple of things on the timeline. So taxes come in when you buy goods and earn income and get a paycheck and all. Budgets have a very specific timeline. We start drawing up the budget in late August, early September. As the Finance Commissioner, I send out budget instructions to all the agencies and departments, including these guys, tax, agency, digital services, and the like. And that kind of starts the process. We send out instructions that most of which are similar year to year in terms of what they need to do, but sometimes we give them guidance as to maybe how generous they might think we are, or how lacking in resources we are, or something like that. But they generally take the next 5 or 6 weeks to work up a budget in their agencies and departments. And then we have budget presentations typically from, let's see, this year it was from, I think our first one was October 7th, and our last one was last week, actually. We started with Buildings and General Services, and we ended with the Vermont Humanities Council, which was interesting, just last week. So it's about a month or so, maybe 5-week period when we go through all of government. And in that regard, it's actually pretty impressive in that I suspect many states don't talk to every single organization that receives an appropriation. And we make it a point to do that, which goes from the Agency of Human Services that receives something like $1 billion to the Vermont Humanities Council I mentioned that receives a couple $100,000. So we're very fastidious about that, and it kind of keeps us in touch with who's getting what and who they are and what they need. So I think it's a nice custom. Anyway, after we get all the information, we collate it, we work with the governor and his or her staff to make sure that in this case, his ideas are reflected in the budget, what his vision is, what his priorities are. But we also work with what revenue we have. I mean, not incidentally, we can't spend more than we have. Actually, I say that when I think in the federal government, we regularly spend more than we have. In the state governments, we do not.
We can.
We
are
can
not
in Vermont.
prohibited.
Right. We can in Vermont, but
We don't.
It's kind of interesting. Vermont's known as a very, well,
Not to overspend.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Vermont's known as a very progressive blue state. Never been an idea they didn't want to invest in. But actually, budgeting, we're pretty skinny. We're all Yankees, really, in many ways. And I think that's a good thing. In that we're very careful with those. Anyway, we present a balanced budget. So we look at revenues and we look at what we want to do, and we kind of make those two lines meet. Now, the governor, with great pomp and circumstance, presents the budget in the 3rd week of January, typically. And then it is handed over to the House, and they take the budget and they do what they want. It's kind of interesting to note, as I mentioned in the prior meeting, the governor has first crack at the budget and gets a lot of attention for his budget, but in fact, it's the legislature that has the sole ability to appropriate money. The governor cannot spend a dime that is not appropriated by the legislature. It's kind of an interesting, the governor's job is to run the executive branch of the administration, but the legislature has the power of the purse. It's kind of an interesting dynamic that I'm sure there was historical reasons for that. So we present the budget at the end of January, and then the House takes it on, and all their various committees do a similar job. They hear from all our agencies and departments. They talk amongst themselves. They work with their own priorities, and they ultimately pass a budget, usually in the middle of March. And then that budget goes over to the Senate, and they do the exact same thing. And the Senate always takes the House budget because of the Senate, and the House is the House, they always make changes. And at the end of April, typically early May, the Senate passes its own version of the budget, and then the House and the Senate get together and they get their budget, the differences worked out, and they come out with one budget that they all vote on, and when that budget passes, it goes back to the governor for his signature, or not. Typically, on rare occasions, the governor has vetoed budgets, I think last year, the year before.
The end of the previous biennium.
The end of the
Three
previous
times.
biennium, we went 2-3 times of a veto, went back to that. Anyway, the good news on that is, to my knowledge, there has never been a budget that hasn't been enacted by the beginning of the fiscal year. I'm sure in 200 and some odd years of history, there must be a time, but I can't think of it. I mean, it's been many, many years. And that's because we have differences. There's always a difference in the executive branch and the legislative branch. They come from different worlds, but we always work it out. And again, I don't want to underemphasize that. That is impressive, particularly when you see what goes on, not just in Washington. There are many other states. In fact, there may still be 3 or 4 states that don't have budgets on July 1 when their fiscal years begin. And we've never, again, in my experience, we've never done that. We've always been able to work it out. So anyway, the timeline, we kind of start at the end of August and we end whenever the budget is signed, typically sometime late May, early June. So it's a long period of time going through this. But, I'm proud to say that by the time the thing is passed, we know what's in it, and we agree on what we're going to do, and it's generally good enough so that we all have something in there that we like. It's very rare that we love a budget. That it's generally the rule of thumb is when everyone can put up with it, but no one really likes it, it's probably a reasonably good budget. You've reached that period of compromise. So in total in Vermont, we spend just over $6 billion, which I always point out is a ton of dough. But next door in Vermont, in New York, they spend that a little over a week every week. So we're a small state. You'd expect they spend more money over there. They have many more people there. So, but $6 billion still it's a lot of money. It's divided, broadly speaking, into 3 main funds. The general fund, which is for general government operation, like taxes, like digital services, like agriculture, like various other functions, Department of Financial Regulation, buildings and general services, that kind of thing. That's the general fund. The education fund, which we spoke at length, really, when we were talking about property taxes, that is filled with property taxes as well as sales taxes, as well as taxes from the Agency of Transportation. It gets kind of a smorgasbord of taxes, but the single largest piece, about $1.1 billion, is for property taxes. Most of which, incidentally, is non-resident and commercial businesses. Not to say that non-residents and commercial businesses aren't Vermonters, most of them in fact are, but the residential property tax that probably causes the most harms is actually the smallest property net on a net basis property taxpayer. But anyway, that fills the ed fund, and then there's the transportation fund. When you go out there and you drive on the roads, state roads, as well as town roads, so you get an appropriation for towns. That's the transportation fund. And in total, we spend a little over $600 million on transportation. A little over half of that comes from the federal government. A little under half of that comes from Vermonters paying various taxes and fees. So in terms of where this $6 billion comes from, the Department of Taxes, I think brings in about a little over $2 billion. A little under $2 billion.
Your slideshow is up, by the way.
Okay. Another $2 billion comes from the federal government. And a final $2 billion is from a variety of things. Transportation is probably the single largest one. But there's also a fairly chunky amount, $300–400 million, that comes from fees that you pay. When you, for example, visit a state park, you pay a day fee, $4 a week. That goes into a fund that helps run the parks. When you get a fishing or a hunting license, you pay a fee for that license. That goes to the Department of Fish and Wildlife for them to pay for wardens and maintain fishing access and ramps and so on. When you're a company and you incorporate, you pay a fee to the Secretary of State and that fee goes to the Secretary of State into their corporation businesses and corporations fund, I think it's called, and that helps run the Secretary of State. So there's literally there's about 110 different fees that we pay. They go into special funds that are designed specifically for that function that the fee is paid. So in a general sense, that's where the money comes from. And I'll finish up by saying the money, I like to think, and I think we all like to think, that there's, particularly with large sums of money, that there's a fair amount of leeway to spend that money on whatever the governor or whatever the legislature wants. And what you find out is that there's precious little leeway actually to kind of go after your fancy. Of the $6 billion, about $2 billion of that is spent on healthcare. In fact, a little over $2 billion is spent on healthcare. That's predominantly our Medicaid program, which is a healthcare program for low and moderate income Vermonters. And that program is very near and dear to Vermont. But it requires a fair amount of assets. And then almost the same amount of money, just slightly less, $1.8 billion is spent on education, which is another program that is near and dear to our hearts. That's not, by the way, higher ed. That's primary and secondary education. So you have almost $2 billion on education, a little over $2 billion on healthcare, and that's already 2/3 of your budget. So the remainder is left for general government operations, many of which I would argue are not truly discretionary. For example, there's about 100 million, say, spent on protection. That includes the judiciary, the attorney general, the defender general, believe it or not, the ABC of Agriculture is also considered protection, because I think back in the day they used to be responsible for the water supply. But those aren't what I would call discretionary expenditures that one day we can wake up and say, we don't really need state police. So when you kind of boil it all down, this relatively small sum of money that you see could change it if the governor, say, has a nice initiative, the legislature wants to do something different. So a lot of that money is kind of what I would call more or less on autopilot. Anyway, so that's kind of a very rapid move through what is a fairly complex process.
So could you mention those big tranches again? Like you said, education.
So education is about $1.8 billion.
Okay.
And healthcare is about $2.1 billion. Between the two of those, you've got almost $4 billion of spending. Again, on programs that are really important to Vermonters, but they take up a fairly large slice of the budget. And I should say that in most states you'll find the percentages will differ. Some states spend more on public education than others, but it's always a sizable chunk. With healthcare, some states spend more state money on healthcare than others, but it's, again, always a sizable chunk. Just the relative portions will differ state to state.
Do you know just roughly off the end what of that 1.8 for education, how much is college, university versus K-12?
So interesting, zero of it is college and university. The higher ed spending in Vermont is exactly $92 million. I know that for a fact because, well, that was last year, because UVM gets $42 million, and the state colleges, they get about $30 million, and BSAT gets the balance. Vermont is very interesting in that regard. I mean, we're perennially torched for being the least supportive of higher ed. And thank God for New Hampshire, because they're, I think, usually just under us. But we always battle with them for the cellar. On the other hand, we are always in the upper 4 or 5 for primary and secondary ed. Which is interesting, because I would argue that, we do think primary, secondary is important, but it's not like we think higher ed isn't important. We've it's developed over the years. Just to give you one final example on that. When UVM became a public institution, which was in 1955, when they merged what was then the University of Vermont, which was private, with the state agricultural colleges, which was public. When they put them together, the state appropriation to UVM was well over half of its budget, which is why you have a lot of legislators on board. Today it's barely 7%. It's just interesting. It's kind of fading. And it's not that it hasn't gone up, it's just that the cost of higher ed has gone up, and the cost of running a higher education school has gone up. And it's one of the things we're struggling with. So, anyway.
If you were to include matching federal funds, which in Medicaid is significant, what in general would the state budget?
Well, of that little over $2 billion, something like $1.3 billion or more is federal, the remaining is state. So we get the predominance of our healthcare spending is federal.
So when we say billion,
Yes.
6 billion, that's Vermont.
No, that's everything. That's
That
federal.
includes $2
That's
billion
state,
of
yes.
That's the
federal.
whole shebang.
So
Okay,
federal is
gotcha.
$2 billion of that,
Gotcha.
of which something like 1.3 or 4, or 1.5 is healthcare alone.
And in
So it's very-
transportation, there's a chunk for transportation.
Transportation, the federal money is a little over 300 million, the state money is a little under 300. Those formulas differ. Interestingly enough, with healthcare, for example, the wealthier the state, the lower the federal match, the lower the federal contribution, which makes sense. The wealthier states can pull more of that burden. With transportation, the formula is a little different than that. I will tell you that Vermont is heavily favored with transportation dollars, in part because there's a minimum for states, that they don't give below, and we're a small state, and so we benefit from that minimum as opposed to a per capita. And in part, believe it or not, because of Jim Jeffers, believe it or not. When he flipped, remember, he became an independent. One of his prizes was they gave him the chair of the Senate Institutions Committee, which worked out brilliantly for Vermont. So forever thank Jim Jeffers when you see the roads paved.
For lots of things.
Right. I think as time is going on, they've changed that, but Vermont is getting favored by transportation. Anyway, thank you for that.
We've got about 7 minutes left before 4:30.
7 minutes.
Before they throw us out of here.
I got my mittens on.
Yeah, before the chili heater on, well, it's actually really nice in the back.
Yeah.
We're gonna shut the door and thaw out.
Oh.
Come on, Cambridge.
Oh my God.
Come on, space heaters, baby.
Yeah, this is what we get for only giving him a buck.
So those-
You're showing us. You could double it next year, Adam.
That's right.
You
have
can take it out of the
money
tax budget, it's fine.
back.
Well, thanks for coming out, guys. And thanks.
Thanks for sticking it out of this chilly room.
I must say,